Metroid Prime Remastered came as a huge shock to me, and it has made my entire month. This is something I feel like we've been hearing about for a while. It seemed like for years we were hearing about these rumors that we were going to be getting a full remake or a remaster of some kind of the original Metroid Prime. Of course, a lot of people were also talking about a full Metroid Prime trilogy for the Switch, but I feel like I heard about that a lot less than I actually did just the one specific game. This is something that's been circulating back in for such a long time that I just started tuning it out, and I sort of accepted it was never going to happen. So when we were watching the Nintendo Direct over at my buddy Nick the Game Apologist's channel, I was very excited about this announcement. From the perspective of Samus Aran. Now, there's only so much I can get into about the game itself, the way it's structured, the way that it plays, everything like that. It's the same game, the game that I reviewed a couple of years ago during Metroid Month. That part has not changed, and it kind of gets into this weird small debate that I've been seeing some people have, whether it's a remake or a remaster, or any of these other adjectives people want to label onto it. But I mean, there are some like semantics that get into that. Yes, this is a little bit more than just upresing the textures and everything like that. A huge amount of work went into this project. It's not just that things look a little cleaner, everything has been completely recreated visually. That being said, in terms of engine and in terms of code, at least from what I've been seeing, this is largely the same. At the end of the day, I don't really care what the specific word should be used to describe this. They're marketing it as Metroid Prime Remastered, so I'll just keep calling it a remaster if it's all the same to you. If you've already seen my Metroid Prime video, you know how I feel about this game, but I do want to discuss this particular remaster, the good, the bad, and yeah, there are a couple of gripes I have to get in there, and why I think you should buy this game now. Before I start knocking a few negatives out of the way, I want to clarify up front that this is my new favorite way to play this game. I absolutely adored my time with this, and I already want to play it again. It's fantastic. This is the version I'm going to be recommending people. It's the most accessible. I think that it probably controls the best. It's just so easy to recommend this over the previous versions, but I do want to get into why not every decision made for this was for the best. Most of this is pretty small stuff. Like, to answer your question right now, no, the fusion suit is not in this game. Please do not expect to unlock that by beating this. It's not there. I do have a feeling that we might actually see a way of getting this once they bring over Metroid Fusion to the GBA emulator on the Switch later on this year. I'm kind of hoping that's the case. I think that would be a fun way to kind of incorporate it in there. I know some people might have an issue with the fact that it would be locked behind a subscription wall as opposed to the original Fusion suit being locked to a completely separate full price game at the time, but hey, that's whatever, right? There are a couple of things like, oh yeah, there's this one animation that was in the original GameCube port that's not in here, like it also was taken out of the Wii version. That's fine, it's okay. There is one little nitpick that I've seen most people bring up, and it's the mirror in the Chozo Ruins doesn't actually reflect Samus anymore. I wonder if maybe it's partly because so much of this game looks so good and the standard is so high that it would look strange if the mirror worked the way it did in the original version, where it was essentially just like not even fully reflecting the character model of Samus. You can tell that it's just another model of her character, and it's just stuck in a T-pose, and it just kind of follows along with her movements. It's not literally a reflection of what's there. I imagine there was probably some concern that it would feel like visual whiplash, where everything is so realistic and polished around it, but this one element was just so like corny, I guess. It was just kind of like, it would be jarring to see something done that same way, or maybe they would just have to find a new way to do it entirely, and maybe it was just a little too much to get into for the one little feature. I would have liked to have seen it there. Personally, I would not have minded if it was just the T-pose model again, but I can live without it. Now, one element that, again, I'm personally okay with, but I definitely understand the complaint about, would be the doors. it's worth noting that yes, one of the several studios that worked on this project was Retro Studios. In fact, I think that they were helming most of it, but there were other smaller studios involved. But it's not the same Retro Studios that worked on the original game. What I mean by that is that it's the same company, but not the same staff. A lot of the same people are no longer a part of this team. That being said, they did respond to this remaster. A lot of them had some really uplifting things to say, and it's nice to see that they were really receptive to watching a new team come in and kind of springboard off of their work, but some things did come up, and two in particular I think are really worth noting. And yeah, the doors. The doors are not really handled the same way they were in the original game. Things aren't layered the way that they used to be. You can kind of see in these comparisons here that the shielding aura around the door is a lot more prominent in the remaster version, whereas it was more subtle in the original, and it kind of feels like the texture is allowed to have a little bit more pop, a little bit more depth in the GameCube and Wii versions. And the guy that actually worked on that original door did have some words to say about that and wasn't really happy to see that they took this in a new direction. Now, this is something that I can actually believe was a deliberate change, and I understand the mentality. Again, the shielding comes off a lot more prominent, and when you're comparing a standard door with, say, a door that's protected with an ice beam shield, the blue door stands out a lot more when it's done like this than it did in the original. So maybe there was something to be said there. That being said, when you're doing a remaster like this, I think that there's a certain level of responsibility that needs to be maintained for the original vision of the developers that once worked on it. You know, what came before and what the old intent was. That's not to say that some things can't be reimagined a little bit, which I think might be the case here. It's a kind of weird, sticky line, and I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it. Again, visually, I don't mind the new doors, but I do understand what the original mentality was for them in the first port of the game, and I can definitely understand why somebody that put that much work into that kind of detail wasn't really happy to see that changed to this degree for the new one. Now, a lot of that is preference stuff, or, you know, it's stuff that is really easy to overlook, but the one major criticism that I have is the fact that, again, a few teams worked on this remaster, and they did an incredible job, and I'm going to gush all over every wonderful thing that they did for this remaster, but somebody somewhere made a really bad decision, and that was just leaving out the original staff that worked on the original version of this game out of the credits entirely. They have a little card at the bottom that just says, oh yeah, credit to these guys who worked on this. That's not actually giving credit to those artists, that's more of just a lazy way of waving off that responsibility. Outside of some remarkable exceptions, video games are a collaborative effort, and something like this, where it's taking the foundation of a full experience that was created over the course of years, painstakingly crafted by a team that put their heart and soul into it, and then you just wave it off with, yeah, credit to those guys, here's all of our work. Whose decision was this? It's just text. Type it in there. It's not that hard to figure out. Nintendo has done this for other remakes and remasters, like Majora's Mask 3D. They have found a way to give credit and had like different, you know, staff roles for the original team that worked on that project, and then the new team that came in and built on it. What's so frustrating about this is how easy it is to just type in somebody's name, and yet 2 Metroid titles in a row, not everyone that is responsible for bringing this project together is properly credited. Why? I'm wondering if there's like some sort of financial thing in here. Maybe there are royalties paid out because people are putting credits. Maybe it's not as simple as, you know, just their names roll on the screen. But whatever the excuse is, it's not good enough. Just give them the credit. That's all I have to say about this. Just patch it in. Just give credit to the damn team that worked on the first game. It's not that hard, guys. People being left out of the credits is not something that I just want to skim by, but I also can't let it keep me from just giving praise to this frankly incredible remaster. The original Metroid Prime was already just an incredible piece of interactive art. This is something that came out on the GameCube like I can't believe it's been like over 20 years now. It's insane. And it was already impressive back then, adding in so many little details and elements in there that made this feel like a truly unique and captivating experience. What this game does is help take that foundation, bring that into the modern day, and then really capitalize on how that original spirit can just be expanded upon, and they take every opportunity that they can to do that. A single reflective surface notwithstanding. I've seen this one sentiment echoed a couple of times, but this is honestly like hand-drawn artwork, but just realized on the screen in motion. I didn't think the Switch was capable of making a game look this good. That sounds hyperbolic, but there was just something done with this art style, or this direction, I suppose. There's something done with the lighting, the shading, the models, the textures. Everything just feels the way it's supposed to. And it's not like they just went in and heightened up the resolution on a few textures or anything like that. No, everything here, at least in terms of visuals, has been completely recreated. The creatures you encounter, the caverns that you explore, everything everywhere just looks phenomenal. I tend to tune out of how impressive things look over time, but in something like Metroid Prime, where this amount of work and care has gone into really capturing what that original intent was, and because this game relies so heavily on its atmosphere, I think this is a kind of game that benefits from something like this sort of remaster more than others would. It's so much harder to just, forget about how good everything looks when being in that world and the complete and total immersion is such an important foundational block to the whole structure. Exploring the Orpheon frigate was already really cool, just seeing like the new ways that they helped recapture a lot of these visuals and everything like that. That shot with Ridley keeps getting shared around for a reason. It's gorgeous. But the one moment that I was the most excited about delivered on every single front, and that was arriving on the landing site on Talon 4. This was already one of my favorite moments in any Metroid game. Hell, in video games in general. Stepping out of my ship, watching as the rain falls down on this beautiful world around me and the music swells into this feeling of grandeur. It's honestly a little indescribable, and it felt like experiencing this game for the very first time all over again. The arrival on Talon 4 was already a really special moment to me that showed me why I love video games as much as I do, why I want to actually go in and create some of my own at some point in the future. And feeling the way that I did about this recreation of that moment meant everything to me. That was worth the price of admission alone. You can see the small details here where it's not even so much that they were just making the original style look better. You can even tell in the way that they modeled this one leaf coming out of the water, and they kind of reimagined what that was supposed to look like. It's not just a one for one, but it's still faithful. This shot, this little sequence here, encapsulates everything I love about this game and this remaster. It's the little details like how they not only brought back the ripple effect in the water from the GameCube version that was cut out of the Wii version, but they even went the extra mile to make it look better than it ever did before. It's the little things like looking up in a rainy environment and watching as the water changes its flow to actually fall down her arm cannon in a different way. That is absolutely insane. It's stuff like seeing this missile expansion hiding behind the ice, whereas it used to be a couple of polygons that were placed in front of it, but now it feels like an ice structure, and you're actually looking at the secret behind it through refraction, and it's so trippy. I haven't been this excited and captivated about what a game could look like or what it could accomplish visually in a very, very long time. I kind of thought that that sort of time had passed, but again, Metroid Prime is a game that already kind of takes advantage of why that matters in a new way, instead of just being like, oh, this thing is shiny. It really puts you in that world, and it enriches your experience within it. And while, yeah, I did complain about one animation in particular missing, there's some where they updated them and it's just more intense than ever. Like Samus hunting a creature and just going into a full-on sprint. It feels so much more intense than it did before. It really makes her feel like a hunter on the prowl. She is just going after her prey great, man. It's so good. The way the textures in certain environments and everything just have this extra layer of depth to them. Man, this game is pretty. I mean, that kind of sounds like the bare minimum when it comes to a remaster, but man, this game is pretty. I couldn't get that thought out of my head the entire time I was playing it. And that was both in, docked and in handheld on my Switch OLED. And I was also really impressed to see that not only did the game look this drop dead gorgeous, but it also ran at an incredibly stable 60 frames per second throughout my entire playthrough. I never saw the frame rate stutter even once. It never dipped below that threshold. And speaking of the way the game performs and how it feels and everything, there are 4 separate controller options for this game. Now, there is one controller option I do have to complain about a little bit, and it's actually the one that ended up getting a little bit of traction on Twitter. The GameCube controller does work for this game with a small asterisk attached. I used the controller adapter that came out for Smash Bros. On the Wii U and an original Nintendo brand GameCube controller, and yeah, for the most part, it controls the way you remember back on the classic system. The catch is, and I do not understand why this is the case, both Start and the Z button are both mapped to, well, the map. Neither one of them goes over to the options where you go into your logbook or you change the game's settings, like swapping over to a different control scheme. And it's not like missing a shoulder button is really the problem here, because the left bumper button in this version of the game is just mapped to a second jump button. They weren't really pressed for options here. I don't understand this, because they do have options for adding extra buttons for accessing your map, but they don't have any options for mapping the start button to your option screen like it worked in the original, and your map over to one of the other buttons that they let you add to the control scheme. It's so stupid, because they have these little controller options where you can basically have the map mapped to 2 buttons at once, but none of the buttons on the GameCube controller are actually mapped to the options. This is dumb. Thankfully, this is something that could be easily fixed in a patch. I don't know if they will, but it is a little bit aggravating. I'm sure that there's a way to fix this through button mapping and stuff like that, but it's such a small problem to fix that doesn't even need to exist in the first place. They did also add an option where you can have something that's sort of like the classic control style, but instead of aiming with, say, the left analog stick, you're actually moving around with that while aiming with gyro, and it feels a little awkward, I'm not gonna lie. It would be one thing, I suppose, if gyro was added to, say, dual stick control, but having to do the thing where you're like holding down a trigger button to aim your arm cannon and then moving the controller, I don't know, something about it doesn't quite connect with me. I'm sure that some people out there are gonna really appreciate this option, and I do like that the option is there. This one in particular, just not for me. They of course brought back the pointer controls. This is essentially how the game controlled back on the Wii during either, the individual release or in the Metroid Prime Trilogy collection. This works really well. I did find it a little awkward. I feel like it doesn't work entirely one-to-one like it did on the Wii, although that is frankly to be expected because you're using gyro sensors and not necessarily actual, the pointing infrared sensor that the original Wii used. I get that, and it's not bad by any stretch. In fact, I do think that this works a little bit better in one sense, that at least here, because you are using a gyro-based Joy-Con, you can recenter where you're pointing at any time. And that is a nice option. I think the only thing for me is that I just don't like how small the Joy-Cons are anyway. I did not try this with the straps attached, so maybe that would help, but for the most part, I just stuck with the dual analog stick control method on the Pro controller, and this feels like it was how the game was always supposed to play. I'm gonna be honest, as much as I like the original GameCube controls, I feel like it's gonna be really hard to ever go back to those after playing the game like this. It feels fantastic to be able to move and aim at the same time. It feels so great to be able to just look around while on the move like this. The responsiveness here, I think, is fantastic, and I got used to the new control layout really, really fast. And the one thing I was concerned about was being able to switch beam weapons, because in the original version of the game, you would use the D-pad to change which visor you were using, and then you would use the C-stick, which was pretty much your second analog stick, not for looking around, but rather for switching which beam you were using at the time. But I think that they found a really natural way to make this work. You really just hold down the X button, and then it changes what the D-pad does. It switches it between choosing your visors and your beams, and there is an option in the options menu for switching which one to get swapped to when you hold that down. The amount of options that are in this game are great. Being able to turn off the HUD, being able to mess with audio levels and stuff like that. A lot of these things are things that I think a lot of players will not actually utilize, but it is always good that they are there. More options are never a bad thing. Some of the options I was most excited to discover was the little things like them actually adding back in the narration that was used in the European and Japanese releases. I think the Japanese version had the most amount of narration, the European had the second, and then it was just cut out completely for the American. And the best part about this is you can choose any of those extremes. You can choose if you want the European level of narration. You can choose if you want the Japanese. You can choose to just not have it at all if you think it sounds cheesy, which yeah, it does, but it was really fun to actually hear that playing throughout the game, especially at the beginning and at the end of the journey. I was really excited about that. There are a couple of things here, like there was a, one little reveal that you get to see after completing a certain amount of the game in the final cutscene that I don't want to show off here because I thought it was really well realized, but in the spirit of the game, maybe that's something you gotta unlock for yourself. And as far as small, like, technical tweaks go, I do know that the speedrunning community has already obviously gotten their hands on this, and they've been kind of toying around with it and seeing what still works in a speedrunning sense and what doesn't. I think that a trick called scan jumping, which I wasn't already familiar with, doesn't really work anymore. And I know that there was an exploit to get the high jump boots early on, and it doesn't work the way that it used to, but people are already finding new exploits to replace the old ones, and you can use like morph ball bombs to get those high jump boots early instead of the old method. People are already starting to dig in deep and find new ways to interact with this game that we've been playing for 2 decades, and that just feels fantastic. If I'm being honest, I could go on for hours about how much I loved my playthrough of this game again. It feels like more than just, hey, it looks nicer. It feels like that's such a core part of this experience, and it feels like it just dragged me back in so much stronger than it had in my past few playthroughs. It was like, again, playing this for the very first time, and that rejuvenation is something that I'm really hoping comes for the other games in this series. You know, Metroid Prime 4 is coming out. Will it be on the Switch or this version of the Switch? I don't know if I can answer that. I still kind of have a feeling it's going to come out later this year, but that's, that's speculation. All I know is that Metroid Prime 2 and 3 definitely deserve to be preserved the way that this first game did. And I hope that if Metroid Prime 4 is still, steady on its way, that we can see this treatment given to the other games in this series, that all of these games can just really feel like they fit together and none of them feel more archaic than the others. I'm really hopeful for that. I guess we'll just kind of have to wait and see what pans out. I stand by my criticisms of certain elements of this game that I stated at the beginning of the video, but again, I don't want that to take away from the incredible amount of work that went into this either. That really just would not be fair, and that would also be slightly hypocritical, but I feel like that's also opening up a different kind of discussion. I still feel like the original game has a place. I think it has a certain level of charm in the way that it looks, and some of the more dated elements I think are still worth going back to. While I was recording footage of that version, I still felt a certain sense of magic that was there that I almost appreciated more after I saw what the game looked like updated. That being said, if people are asking me how to get into Metroid Prime, then you had better believe I'm going to be recommending the Switch port. This is an amazing experience. This is a fantastic adventure. I'm hoping that so many more people that never got to experience Metroid Prime before get to now, and they get to see it in a whole nother level of glory. This is incredibly exciting to me, and it just makes me so much more hopeful as a Metroid fan. This game is already available on the Nintendo eShop for $40, and it should be releasing on the 22nd of this month for the same price physically. I cannot recommend enough that you pick up this game, especially if you've never played Metroid Prime before. Please, please, please experience this if you can. And in the spirit of giving credit where it's due, I need to express my appreciation to everyone who keeps the lights on here at Wayne is Boss HQ. That would be you, the viewer, my wonderful subscribers, and if you're not one of them, please consider becoming one, all of my generous Patreon supporters, and of course, I have to give a very special shout out to my top tier patrons. This month they are Brennan Hess, Earl Valco, Jeremiah Harrison, Lederick, McKenzel, Mr. Dr. SP, Doctorate Pending, NBTV, Nickel Plated, Patricia Marcoux, Cinderin7, and Cirrus the Skeptic. Thank you all so much. You make this possible and you make it worth it. With all of that said, more Digimon content is on the way, and I need to go learn how to play some card games. See you next mission.